I want you to notice your objectives for today are to be able to tell the difference between linear and exponential growth. We're going to go over what those types are. And then you'll also need to be able to describe how abiotic and biotic factors affect population growth. So another way of saying that is being able to know and use some examples of living and non-living limiting factors. Okay? So, it does not matter which population we're talking about, whether that population be people in a town, or ants in an anthill, or dogs that live in a city, or trees in a field. That population isn't going to stay the same size forever. Okay? Populations experience growth, but they don't experience linear growth, where the population increases by the same number each time. So if you had an allowance and your parents gave you $5 every week, and every week you put that $5 into your piggy bank would experience linear growth, where the amount that you were adding went up by the same amount each time, right? That's an example of linear growth. The reason we call it linear growth is if we plot it on a graph, it makes a straight line. Okay? It's going up by the same amount every time, so it's going to make a nice, straight, diagonal sloping line for us. So that is linear growth. But populations don't experience linear growth. Instead, they experience what we call exponential growth, where the population increases by a percentage each year. So instead of increasing by the same amount, it increases by a percentage. Because 2% of 100 is going to be more than 2% of 10, populations can actually explode in size. You can think about this in terms of if you have something like, let's say, mice, right? Mice can reproduce really quickly, and then the more mice you have, the more mice are reproducing, which is why we're increasing not by a specific amount, but by a percentage. And so you're going to see this population grow and grow and grow very quickly. Instead of looking like a straight line, like linear growth on a graph, exponential growth tends to look like a curve like this, where you start with a few and then that population just explodes into a larger number. But you're going to notice that most of the time, the graphs for population growth don't wind up looking like this. They wind up looking like this, where they explode and then they reach a certain limit and they stop exploding. The population stops going up. And that is because we're going to learn of several things, but there is only a certain amount of organisms that can survive in an ecosystem. There are limits to population size. Okay? Each species has what we call a biotic potential. This is the highest rate of reproduction under ideal conditions. Okay? So another way of saying this is, if conditions are perfect, what's the maximum number of new organisms that species can produce? And this varies from species to species. It's not the same for every species, okay? This is because different organisms require different amounts of time to reproduce. So a dandelion doesn't take very long to grow, okay? And then it can spread hundreds of seeds, and each of those seeds is capable of growing into a whole new plant. So dandelions have a very high biotic potential, right? They have a very short life cycle, and then they produce tons of offspring at the end of their life cycle. So under ideal conditions, dandelions can produce thousands of new dandelions in months, which I'm sure you have experienced if you've ever tried to rid your lawn of them. However, the biotic potential of humans is significantly smaller than that of dandelions, because even under ideal conditions, a human can only make 1 to 2 new humans every 9 months, depending on if you are lucky enough to have multiples. if you aren't lucky enough to have multiples, then you're just going to be able to produce one new human every 9 months, right? So it takes us a lot longer to reproduce, a lot longer to grow up to reproductive age than a dandelion, and we are only capable of producing one offspring or maybe two, sometimes 3 or 4 at a time in very exceptional circumstances, okay? So we have a much lower biotic potential than a dandelion. Biotic potential is one of the factors that plays into why population sizes are limited, okay? Because for us, your biotic potential may be a very interesting limiting factor that really affects how many humans there can be. But for dandelions, it seems like their biotic potential should not be a limiting factor, right? Because their biotic potential is huge. So if they have such a high biotic potential, why don't dandelions just take over the world? Well, there are other things at play limiting the size of a dandelion population, okay? Every ecosystem has what's called a carrying capacity. This is the largest number of individuals an environment can support on an ongoing basis. Okay? Each ecosystem is going to be a little bit different depending on a bunch of factors, but there is a limit to how many organisms that environment can support. Carrying capacity is going to be determined by a sum of all the limiting factors in an area. We learned about limiting factors yesterday, where we said limiting factors are things in an environment that limit the size of a population. Okay, so it makes sense that all those limiting factors would create a carrying capacity for us. Limiting factors can be non-living things. Okay? So some examples might be water, or temperature, or amount of light available. The weather in an area can be a limiting factor. The amount of rainfall that an area gets can be a limiting factor. Whoops. So all these things affect organisms by their needing it and then determining if there is enough for them or not. Okay? So if you have a limited amount of rainfall, like in a desert, right? Deserts can only support a very small amount of plant life because there's a very limited amount of water available. So the carrying capacity of a desert is much smaller than the carrying capacity of a rainforest because they have a limit to how much water they have to give. And once that water is used up, any organism that's trying to live there isn't going to get water, and then at that point it's not going to survive. Same thing for things like temperature, right? If the temperature is not right in an area for an organism, then it won't survive there. So that will limit how many organisms can live in that area. Temperature isn't one where you're like, I'm gonna run out of this, right? You can't run out of a temperature, but you can reach temperatures that certain organisms can't survive at, and so that will limit the size of your population to just organisms that can tolerate that temperature. Now, limiting factors can be more than just non-living things. There are ways in which living things can be a limiting factor. Okay? The first one of those that we're going to discuss is predation. So any time that animals are in a predator-prey relationship, this is going to limit the size of both of those populations, actually. Okay, so you would think that in a predator-prey relationship that it would just be the prey population that has its size limited, right? Because it's the one getting eaten. But if you think about it, there's a relationship there where if they're eating that animal for food and then that animal suddenly disappears, that's going to affect the predator as well, right? So predator-prey relationships limit both population sizes. So you'll notice, right, you see an increase in the prey population first on the graph, right? And then there's a increase in the predator population slightly after that. But as that predator population gets larger, they start eating more and more prey, and then you see a dip in the prey population followed by a dip in the predator population. So they are affecting each other and effectively limiting how large that population can get. Environmental factors. These can be density dependent or density independent. And we're going to discuss what that means, okay? If something is density dependent, then that means as you get more and more organisms in the same sized area, this factor will have a stronger effect. So you can think about these things being like disease and competition, okay? If you have a room or a population, right, and the people are very closely packed together, it's easier for disease to spread, right? And so disease has a higher impact. If you have more organisms in an area, then they are competing for resources. So as you put more and more organisms in there, there's more and more competition. These are density dependent. Things like parasites. Again, we're thinking about how easy is it to pass this from one organism to another. If they're in close proximity to each other, it's going to become easier. So those things tend to be things that are density dependent. Density independent factors are factors that are going to affect a population no matter how many organisms are in that population. These are things like floods, right? It doesn't matter how many gophers are living in an area. If the area floods, it's going to affect all the gophers, right? And it's not going to affect them more or less depending on how many of them were in the area. It's just going to affect them. The same thing is true for habitat destruction, right? These things don't necessarily get more or less effective depending on how many organisms live in the area. And then lastly, we have competition, which we've already talked about a little bit, but it bears talking about again, which is when animals have different niches, but they are using the same resource, you're going to experience some level of competition because they're going to want to use the same resources, and only one population can get those resources, right? You can't give them to both in equal amounts. One is going to get more, one is going to get less, so there will be competition occurring. And then the last one is crowding. Crowding is if species live too closely together, okay? So there's a reason why you have to have a certain size aquarium if you want a certain number of fish, or you have to have a certain size yard if you want a large number of dogs, right? It's because as you start to put too many organisms in one space, there start to be negative effects from that. And those effects can range all the way from getting more aggressive or more territorial to abandoning their young and not taking care of them. So they can range the whole gamut in terms of how overcrowding affects that organism. But we obviously want to avoid it. So if an area gets too crowded, then that's going to limit the size of the population because things are going to start happening that are bad for that population, and organisms are going to start dying off. What I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to go to this simulation here. If you click on the link, what you're going to see is a little simulation screen where there's a graph at the bottom, and then there's a picture over to the side that shows different colored pixels for different organisms. And then on the top left side, you're going to see that there is a list of organisms, and they have them arranged sort of in a food web energy pyramid situation where they have all the producers on the bottom level and then all of the consumers going up levels like you would see on an energy pyramid. You can determine by clicking on an organism what it eats and whether or not it is present in your ecosystem. What I want you to do is I want you to mess around a little bit and observe how these organisms interact with each other and limit the sizes of their populations in this simulation. And then I want you, after you've run a couple of simulations, to try to determine what's the carrying capacity for this population, or for this ecosystem? What's the maximum number of organisms that this ecosystem can support? Okay? All right, go ahead and mess with it for a little bit. This is just the end of our notes now.